This podcast will analyze various effects of being a child soldier in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as give the reader insight as to why children are being recruited for irregular and regular armies in today's world. Some children voluntarily enroll themselves into armies or military groups as child soldiers. This is generally viewed as a problem in Congo, and there are various NGOs looking to make a difference in this area. These points and facts will be thoroughly analyzed within the podcast to help further the argument that child soldiers should be globally condemned and prohibited. We will start by looking at testimonies of former child soldiers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. All of these testimonies have been kept anonymous due to the individuals being minors and children. We will look at a couple of the testimonies mentioned in this article by the International Review of the Red Cross. These testimonies have, of course, been kept anonymous due to the speakers being minors and children. We will start by looking at a testimony from a 15-year-old male. The kid was working with 3 friends in the fields, helping his mother, when 6 members of an armed group captured them. One friend was allowed to go, but the kid and the other 2 friends were forced to walk for 3 days to the base of the armed group. The conditions were very dirty and poor, as they had walked over hills through the mud to get there while lacking sleep. They were enrolled in a local school by the armed group to continue their studies while being accompanied constantly by 4 armed men back and forth to school. At the camp, the kid learned how to handle a gun and was tattooed and initiated in taking care of the gris. He was unable to continue his studies, and a month later, he finds out his friends had escaped and told his parents where he was being kept. His parents negotiated his release by offering a goat to the armed group, but this was declined as the commander wanted a cow. The kid spent about 3 years walking through forests on duty. He was forced to rob people on main roads and was forced to take part in 5 military operations against other armed groups. This had a negative result for him as he got shot in the mouth and lost 4 teeth in the process. He was taken to the hospital, and when the armed group came to collect him, they were attacked by government forces, which gave the kid the opportunity to escape his reality. He returned to his family, but was forced to remain in hiding as he was facing arrest from the armed group. His family talked to a Red Cross volunteer who informed the ICRC of his situation. He was then moved to a center for former child soldiers in Bukavu, where he was to be protected. 3 months later, he was reunited with his family. But within weeks, he received a letter from the armed group inviting him to join back with a promise that he would be treated well. This ignited fear once again, and his family contacted the ICRC, who evacuated the child again to Bukavu. In his own words, the kid states, "The only way I will ever be left in peace is if my former commander dies or surrenders to the government forces." There was nothing I liked about life, but thanks to the ICRC, I can pursue a hairdressing apprenticeship, which I am about to finish. The boy wants to start a salon now, which is how he envisions his new and more positive future. This statement from the child shows how NGOs such as the Red Cross are extremely important in saving these kids from becoming child soldiers. Without the help from external actors, it is very likely that the kid would have become a child soldier again and would have had to relive his trauma because he would not have been able to get relocated to a safe haven such as Bukavu. A common misconception is that child soldiers are males, when in reality, females are abducted to serve duty to these armed groups as well. Let's look at a testimony from a 16-year-old female. She joined an armed group in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo and was no longer studying because she wasn't clever enough for school. One day, armed men came into her aunt's shop where she worked, drank everything they had, and then asked her to go with them to their base so that she could get paid. She voluntarily accepted and asked 2 of her friends to accompany her. When they arrived, they were immediately locked up for 2 days. The armed group was preparing to fight, and that's when they were let out and told that they could choose between being a child soldier and dying. This left them no choice but to become child soldiers for this armed group, and so they got initiated. That night, fighting broke out, and they were forced to partake in the fight the whole night. In the process, she had witnessed one of her friends that accompanied her get killed. And so she stayed with the group to avenge her lost friend. One day they were engaged in a clash with another armed group and ran out of ammunition. Some of the members had gotten captured. 12 children, including her, had attempted to escape during this incident. However, they were intercepted by another group. They were beaten and locked up at this armed group's base and were initiated as child soldiers once again. It was difficult for her to eat as she had to steal livestock in order to get food, forcing her and others to rob villages. A friend of hers, who was only 9, was killed while fighting in front of her own eyes. But the violence was within the armed group as well, not only from opposing forces. In her own words, she stated, "It was not easy being a girl in an armed group. Sometimes the boys protected us from the violence meted out by the adults. But the commanders took advantage of night patrols to sleep with the girls. They intimidated us, and if you refused to sleep with them, they would kill you and then go back to the camp and say you had been killed in the fighting." The sexual violence against young girls within these armed groups was consistent, and there wasn't anything that could be done but to escape. The girl took the little money that she had to escape to North Kivu, where she still lives in fear, as everyone there knows she had been a child soldier in an armed group. These testimonies are key insights from primary sources on the conditions these child soldiers are forced to live under. Some child soldiers have the benefit of NGOs to protect them, whilst some are forced to escape on their own. Both male and female child soldiers fall victim to joining these armed groups, and some may join voluntarily based on promises that turn out to be false, while others get taken from their families without prior warning, and their families are forced to negotiate their return, which remains unlikely. Sexual violence against child soldiers is more common than is discussed, as is observed and analyzed by Rosemary Gray. Rosemary Gray from the University of New South Wales, Australia, provides valuable information on sexual violence against child soldiers in association with the limits and potential of international criminal law. Girl soldiers are often raped and sexually enslaved, while many are used as bushwives by commanders and allied soldiers. According to Gray, this issue of sexual violence against female child soldiers has become more globally noticeable, as in more recent cases before the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court, action has been taken to attempt prosecution of this illegal conduct using the framework provided by the ICC. Rosemary Gray goes on to further state that this issue has most recently been addressed in the case of the prosecutor V. Bosco Ntaganda, one of the 6 cases that have been addressed by the ICC from the circumstances in the Democratic Republic of Congo. According to Gray, on June 9th, 2014, the pre-trial chamber confirmed the charges in the Ntaganda case and found that the rape and sexual slavery of female child soldiers in Ntaganda's armed group by allied members of that group could constitute war crimes under a specific article found in the Rome Statute. This demonstrates the limits of international law in situations of sexual violence. Only 6 cases were brought to the attention at the time of the ICC, making it difficult to not only prosecute but also enforce regulation due to an immensely small sample size of cases brought before the courts. From this arises large campaigns against the use of child soldiers, leading us to the discussion of the international campaign to provide child soldiers. Global awareness of child soldiers has led to an international campaign to prohibit this act of injustice. The participation of child soldiers in armed groups has been globally condemned as an inhumane act of injustice and declared a war crime under the Rome Statute of the ICC. However, according to Jay Williams from the University of Technology in Sydney, there have been hundreds of thousands of children who have fought and died in armed group conflicts globally. In 2006, there was an estimation made by the UN that over 300,000 children were actively engaging in armed conflict for various armed groups. There have been arrests made in this regard, as Williams further states. On March 17, 2006, Thomas Lubanga from the Democratic Republic of Congo became the first individual to be arrested based on a warrant provided by the ICC for war crimes against children. He was charged with enlisting and conscripting children under the age of 15 years old to take part in various hostilities. The crucial findings of Jay Williams' article was that the DDR, which is the disarmament and reintegration programs, were not sufficiently funded due to a lack of international support from superpower nations such as the US, Russia, and China. Many girl soldiers fell out of these DDR programs, and the minimum age of 15 was too truncated to join armed groups. It would be more realistic that the new minimum age be changed to 21 for active combat service, as at that point, individuals would no longer be considered minors and internationally would be deemed as adults. This should be done with the intent to reduce the frequency of the enrollment of child soldiers who are still deemed minors on a global scale. But representation can be misperceived, and the reality of this situation could be much different, which leads us to our next topic. Although the common perception is that the child soldiers are forced into these lives, Lucille Gretry challenges the reality of this representation, as she suggests that child soldiers are represented as passive victims, while the reality of their life shows their capacity for action and decision making. particularly in some cases, such as, for example, the testimony of the 16-year-old girl who was asked to enroll into the armed group in exchange for money. Though it was under false pretense, it was a decision she made for herself and brought 3 friends along with her. Questions should be raised to properly analyze the lives of these child soldiers, such as which social representations of childhood does the image of child soldier convey, and how far does the role of child soldier call into question our definition of childhood? From a methodological point of view, how should we undertake research about and with children that live in these radical environments? Without asking the proper questions on the other end of the spectrum, it is much more difficult to formulate an efficient way of identifying and saving these children. But do all child soldiers need saving? This leads us to transition to understanding voluntary enrollment of child soldiers. The cessation of child soldiers constitutes a difficult obstacle in the reconstruction of societies post-armed conflicts. In most cases, children are forced to enroll in these armed groups. However, as Theodore Ndongo states in his article Understanding Voluntary Enrollment of Child Soldiers, a Key to Reintegration, very few studies focus on the voluntary enrollment of children into armed groups. Through extensive research, Ndongo found that some children voluntarily participated in armed conflict. The motivation behind this voluntary enrollment is usually due to a variety of reasons, such as family mistreatment, cruel violence, and loyalty issues. In some cases, these factors lead children to seek a new group to belong to in order to redeploy the child's subjectivity. This is a significant extension of Lucille Grétry's article, which challenges the representation of these child soldiers. This is crucial for reintegrating a child into society, as it is important to understand why they were enrolled in the first place and who enrolled them, or was it a voluntary self-enrollment? It is clear that children find themselves involved with these armed groups for various reasons, whether it be voluntary or involuntary. However, when it comes to the NGOs who make it a goal to save these children, are these factors taken into consideration when saving these kids? Karen Wells argues that the reasoning for why children get involved in fighting and the psychosocial impacts of both forced and voluntary participation are excluded by these NGOs who frame war as an assemblage of discrete issues that can be made the target of specific interventions. These NGOs are committed to human rights and the ideology that children are perceived as rights-bearing subjects. However, child rights, as Karen Wells argues, are deployed as a supplement rather than an alternative to established discourses of child saving. My perception on this is that it should be taken into consideration the circumstances under which the child joined an armed group as a child soldier. This is important because it could be possible that some of these kids do not want saving, as fighting and conflict is all they have known for their whole lives. On a serious note, there are many children who do not have a choice and would want to escape their current situation in an armed group. However, it would be incorrect to state that taking some children away from armed groups is considered saving them. This is because for many children who are participating in armed group conflict, this is all they have known for their whole lives. They are so far gone from normal society because their whole childhood has revolved around conflict and fighting for these armed groups. They may even lack the social skills to have a good life in what we consider a normal society, which is important as it poses the question, how do we reintegrate these children back into society? There is hundreds of thousands of child soldiers and not enough resources allocated to properly reintegrate them back into society the way we see it. This then could be argued that it would be doing some of these children a disservice by pulling them out of armed groups and putting them in an environment where this is a feeling of not belonging. The feeling of belonging to a group is a main reason for why many children voluntarily join illicit armed forces, and to take that away from them without a proper plan on what would be done next, it could be deemed to be detrimental to the child in a sense. My analysis on this ongoing issue regarding child soldiers is that NGOs should be more in tune with the culture of the Democratic Republic of Congo, as it seems to me that NGOs are judging whether or not children need saving from armed groups based on a Eurocentric criteria. In our culture, it is not right to use children as soldiers in times of conflict. However, this is not the same in every culture, as the environment is different. Our children are taught to go to school, find a dream, and pursue it. In the situation regarding child soldiers, many kids are taught to fight with an honor for the armed group they are enrolled to, and education is not considered important considering the environment they are growing up in. Now, my question is, how do you reintegrate such kids into society? It would be very difficult for a child soldier who has seen more in their current young life than most people ever see to join society under the current ideologies instilled in them. The testimony of the 16-year-old female tells all, as she has been somewhat reintegrated into society, however, still lives in fear and is viewed as different due to everybody knowing she was a former child soldier. How does one recover from trauma witnessed on the battlefield at such a young age? I do agree that the ICC should change the minimum age from 15 years old to 21 years of age to save some of these kids from an early childhood trauma. And I do agree that those who do not follow this law should be prosecuted. However, I do not agree with the labeling of all child soldiers as victims, as it is simply untrue. It is tragic that children turn to these armed groups for whatever reasons, but the reality is that to some of these children, loyalty to their armed groups is all they have, and taking them away from that would be a disservice in a sense. So, to conclude this podcast, NGOs should formulate a more specific criteria for differentiating child soldiers that need help as opposed to those that are not looking to be saved. Child soldiers and child rights are different in various cultures, and this should be taken into account, as it is easy to judge a culture based on your own values. However, it is significantly more difficult to attempt to understand the reasoning behind the beliefs of certain cultures from an unbiased perspective, unlike a Eurocentric vision. I am of the belief that child soldiers should not be allowed based on my own values, principles, and ideologies. But the reality is, not everyone shares the same values and ideologies as others, and thus, it is important to understand the reasoning behind their actions and if it is justifiable in their own culture. Thank you.